Well, it's time now for our focus report and analysis. This Friday, we look into the US's anti-fascist movement. Well, it's been around for decades. The movement has returned to prominence following the so-called Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where counter-protester Heather Heyer was killed after a vehicle struck the crowd. That day, members of the movement physically clashed with far-right activists taking part in the controversial rally. Sparking additional tensions, President Trump then infamously referred to some of the attendees in the far-right crowd as fine people before launching into a tirade about those on the other side who were dressed in black and acted violently, a swipe at members of the Antifa. Well, this has all contributed to boosting the movement's visibility in the media. However, as our reporter Gallagher Fenwick reports, approaching those who say they are affiliated with it can be difficult.
Black Lives Matter!
Because of its tactics and ideology, Antifa remains a controversial part of America's political landscape. Following these self-described anarchists is notoriously complicated. Some of them are particularly aggressive when cameras are pointed in their direction.
Okay, well, that's fine. We can block you out.
Those who agree to talk to us assert that President Trump has emboldened neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
Punch a Nazi in the face! Every nation, every race! Punch a Nazi in the face!
They feel like it's their time to show again. You know, they haven't been condemned. They haven't, if anything, they've been told that they're still good people.
On this particular day, the organizers of a White Lives Matter rally end up canceling their march. Counter-protesters claim victory.
If anybody was ever designed to kick Nazis' ass, it would be them folk.
Unlike many of her fellow activists, Lacey McCauley is not opposed to speaking with the media. She says popular resistance to fascism is growing.
I think a lot of people have just come off of the sofa, come out from behind their screens because they realize it's really important. It's really important to oppose these white supremacist Nazis and KKK members and everything.
Lacey McCauley and others are taking part in a 300-mile bike ride. According to them, this is yet another way of engaging with the enemy.
We're here to raise awareness that repression is happening every day in this country. And if we don't oppose it, we could go into so-called American fascism. This is activism too, and this is anti-fascism too. Yeah.
The pictures posted along the way also help in the fight against the bad press that Antifa often gets.
They can portray all these things in the media. Like, the reality is the people that actually know us know that that's not the kind of work we do. And even whenever we do take the streets or we do things that are considered violent, that that's all for the greater goal of just ensuring the safety and security of our communities.
The American Antifa movement is inspired by its European predecessor, which emerged in the 1920s. That is the essence of the theory that author Mark Bray develops in a book he just published. He is one of the leading experts on a topic which he is not neutral about.
I myself do not have experience doing anti-fascist organizing, though I hate fascism as much as the next person.
For this writer, the fight against fascism has legitimate reasons for resorting to violence.
Anti-fascists argue that self-defense is necessary in the struggle against fascism. Certainly, in the 30s and 40s, there were times when that struggle took on mortal dimensions. And so I think many people would agree there came a time across Europe when standing up to fascists and Nazis violently was legitimate. But anti-fascists argue that the best way to stop that from being a necessity is to prevent them from organizing, prevent them from being able to express their message before it gets to the point where there's a civil war.
Physical confrontation is definitely something that Laura Sennett is not interested in. She calls herself the Antifa CIA, and this is her weapon of choice.
And I think he's in.
Laura specializes in a practice known as doxing.
There he is. That's
It consists in identifying far-right extremists and outing some of them online.
You can see his various addresses.
A name and shame of sorts.
This is pretty powerful stuff. I mean, this is basically like showing what's inside somebody's underwear. This is very personal and embarrassing for people. So how we handle this information, we have to handle it very carefully.
After Charlottesville, doxing helped identify those who attacked counter-protesters. Their information was given to authorities.
Some of those guys have been arrested. They've been extradited and arrested to Charlottesville, and some of them are now sitting in jail cells.
Higher, say her name. Heather, higher, say her name.
Because of its secretive nature, it is nearly impossible to gauge the growth of the many facets of Antifa. The term has become a label which anyone can claim or simply don in public when protesting.
Black Lives Matter. You gotta pay the troll toll. You wanna get into this, boys, huh?
I just show up places and do stuff as a part of Antifa. Like, it's not really a centralized organization. There aren't any leaders. Sometimes people form like local chapters and they meet up to discuss like stopping fascism in their neighborhoods. But there is no like central organizing committee. There's no like president of Antifa. There's no actual membership numbers.
Many in this crowd argue that the Trump presidency has caused for those on the conservative side of the political spectrum to slide further to the right. That same logic clearly also applies to part of those on the left.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by our guest, political science lecturer Alice Béja. Hello, thank you for being with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Now let's start off on that report's final point, that Trump's rise to power has emboldened both the far right and the far left. In equal measure, do you think?
I think it's always very dangerous to equal, for instance, anti-racism with racism, anti-fascism with fascism, regardless of the methods that are employed to fight one or the other. I do think that there has certainly been an emboldening of the far right due to Trump's election, due to his speeches pertaining to race and other issues, due to his associations with people like Stephen Bannon. On the other hand, so there is a radicalization of the right in the United States currently. There is also a resurgence, it's true, of movements of the left that are not, however, limited to Antifa, although they have gained traction in the media recently.
That's right, because we're hearing about the left more than we have ever before somehow in the US. Is there sort of a broadening of the political spectrum in the US right now as a result of Trump's election?
I wouldn't call it a result of Trump's election. I would date it back, for instance, to Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and the consequent movements that have developed and that resulted in part, although it's not that automatic, in Bernie Sanders' candidacy to the primary of the Democratic Party. So there is certainly I don't know if we can speak of a legitimacy, but certainly the fact that Bernie Sanders was able to call himself a socialist and not be completely marginalized on the political field gives a sense of this broadening of the spectrum. Then the matter will be of how this will translate politically over the next few years.
And what do we know of the people who join this Antifa movement?
It's a movement that's very difficult even to call a movement and difficult to quantify and to map because, as was said in the report, there's no leader. It's a horizontal, leaderless movement, and therefore anyone can basically claim the moniker of Antifa to do an action. So there are local groups, but it is a very small minority in the United States currently.
Now, of course, unlike most European nations, we're talking about the US, a country where firearms are readily available. Does that make this rise of extremes all the more worrying?
It does, although I would say that the issue of firearms in the United States is not preoccupying mainly because of these issues of political violence. I would also add that there is another element seen from Europe that must be taken into account, and that is free speech in the United States that is very different, for instance, from France, and that leads to the fact that white supremacists and neo-Nazis can demonstrate and do actions and make speeches, which they could not do in France, which can also account for the mobilization of people against those rallies.
Now, one Antifa member there in that report explained that she was using facial recognition tools to flag up the far-right activists who did resort to violence during their rallies. Aren't the police already doing that work?
Yes, there is. So although there is absolute free speech in the United States, this doesn't mean that those groups are not tracked, for instance, by the FBI. However, one central belief of the Antifa movement is that the state cannot be trusted to fight fascism. And just as the state didn't prevent fascism from rising to power in the 20s and 30s in Europe, they posit a historical continuity between that fascism and the fascism today, and therefore their premise is that it is citizens who have to take this fight into their own hands by any means necessary.
So why do the Antifas have such bad press in the US media then?
Well, first of all, because of the violence, obviously. Also because they won't talk to the press, and that's always getting bad press if you don't want to talk to them. But there's also, I think, a paradoxical element, because on the other hand, it does make for good TV because it can become violent. And so it's, I would say, almost easier to cover than other more mainstream or political movements that, you know, defend people through courts or through peaceful demonstrations or through community building, which is, you know, much less easy to televise, for instance.
And as we've said, the Antifas aren't the only activists fighting against the far-right supporters of Donald Trump and the far-right just generally. Is their call to physical action likely to gain more traction after events like Charlottesville?
To be honest, it's very hard to hypothesize on that. Certainly, the violence on the extreme right can engender a kind of, and there is, I mean, the violence in the U.S. currently is not limited to physical violence. There's a violence in political debate. There's a symbolic violence that is very strong currently in the U.S. So, to be honest, I wouldn't want to hypothesize on this.
Alice Béja, thank you very much for having spoken to us.